All right, welcome back, everyone. Get started on our final bit for the day. So I wanted to just welcome Matias because I haven't introduced him yet. Matias is joining us from Central California, and he's a founder and operator of Dynamics, a consultant-based service focused on the art and science of biodynamic agriculture and holistic design. And he's worked on a whole bunch of different biodynamic projects, primarily in the Americas, but all around the world. And he's currently, I guess, building out a research sanctuary that they've named Matrioso with his partner Svava up in the beautiful California Sierras. And he's been a wonderful help in networking to bring some of our speakers. So thank you, Matias, for joining us.
Thank
And
you.
I asked him to join us today because of his experience working all up and down the Americas. I think he really has a unique perspective on what's happening in some of those grassroots organizations and farms, and wanted him to participate today in sharing some of his experiences with us that way. So I'm going to bring in Danilo and Dennis as well. Hey there. Welcome, fellows.
Yo.
So I wanted to start today just by bringing in a couple of the questions that I had put to Eduardo about the relationship to traditional agriculture that biodynamics can have. I wanted to start to bridge some of those connection points because we've been talking so much about how the scientific part is important, but when that and the profit motive becomes so strong that it drives out really some of that gemut that Dennis was talking about this morning. And wanted to kind of bring in this question of traditional agriculture, which still has a connection to, you might say, the spirits of the place. And maybe Matias, just so we can hear you to kind of give us a sense of who you are and what you're bringing. Maybe we can start with you.
Could could you say that question in maybe just a little bit of a different way? Because I have
Yeah,
several parts in there. Yeah.
yeah. Well, sort of the simple question is, what bridge is there between traditional agricultural practices that recognize maybe the being of a place and
Mhm.
biodynamics?
Yeah. Well, we had many experiences over time trying to work on the language of that bridge and had some, yeah, amazing insights when we were down in Mexico, hosting a kind of a Michaelmas festival down there. And this was on in an area that had hundreds of years of traditional ritual practices and work on the land there. And here we were bringing a new festival that had a focus on agriculture and biodynamics. And we had to kind of go through a little bit of a question of how to honor those traditional practices and not just sort of come in with something that you could say was sort of trying to jump just right over all of that work that had been done there. And in the setting up of all these designs of the festival and the buildings, the main gathering space, which was a large tent where there was the stage where all the speakers were happened to be right where over all those hundreds of years of ritual, an altar had been formed there to give, you could say, offerings to nature and to the spiritual world. And and knowing that that was going to take place, we prior to this whole festival got invited to come to that annual ceremony and had worked there with the people. And also in that, we're sharing that we were going to come and do things in this space. And it kind of led to having to get the okay from the grandmother. And so when I eventually went over to the grandma's little part within the ceremony, she actually shared a story with me about kind of what was sort of behind their altar and ritual process there, which many of the men were there bringing items and doing prayers and doing ceremonies, and each family would bring their little shrine tchotchke and would put their all their crosses and things. But she said that in the olden times, the cross meant something different. And she pointed up to the great cross in the star of the sky and said it was more about the great garment of, and they had their own language for that divine being, which was a feminine being, and said that the mysteries were really in the flowers and how you're connecting with nature on that spiritual level. And so that for me was a doorway to see how they had that reverence towards those things in how they were forming that altar to be a kind of a segue and saying we need to put an altar here to also honor these traditions. But then Dennis was able to help kind of bring in something that was more of a participant type of individuals within a community that form the altar together with a different type of more alchemical approach. And so I felt like there was out of that some very interesting things that happened. And if you don't mind me sharing this, bro, but Dennis had an experience of one of the main shaman women who was leading a lot of some of the ceremonies in our festival was holding old traditions, but when she saw the new paths that were coming, she was very inspired and wanted to sit there to hear what was being brought because she knew out of her own tradition that things still had to be renewed.
Right. Yeah. So it's in a way the honoring of what's there, but also
Hmm.
dancing with it.
Yeah, dancing with it. But I think the dance, like I was saying, there's something with ritual life, and that just is how you're aligning your consciousness to the consciousness of the things that reside in those traditions. And out of that, there tends to be insights that you can be given to then how to maybe conduct some of these bridges or how to usher in some of these newer practices.
Yeah. Huh. And Danilo, in your tradition down there, I imagine there's sort of a Catholic element that has come in with the conquistadors, but you were talking about several cultures that were there. Was it the Kuna as well as the Mayans who came up later? Could you tell us a little bit about that, how that's influenced your relationship to biodynamics?
Yes, apparently the Huetares actually were here before the Mayans, and after the Mayan Empire diminished, they came back to this area. This is kind of the story. I would say that for sure, praying on behalf of others is also perceived by the forces above, and what Matias was explaining is kind of a ritual in which a human, knowing that it's free, has a sense of responsibility. And that ability to act in a way is a decision that would help them do good deeds independently of duty, gratitude, or knowledge. And the more important thing is to hold space for that and sit with it for a while with those deeds, and eventually you would be able to perceive or receive an inner guidance that would point the way. And this is kind of the starting point in which um, I've seen practices that through my small understanding of agriculture. I went to college and everything. I wanted to do a plan and a package and stuff like that. That's kind of what they show you. But if you go to an old farmer, or a old abuela or abuelo, it's what like Eduardo was saying. There's very into our culture to ask permission, to try to communicate with that spiritual world, and that's something that integration is, it's amazing, and it brings diversity to our culture. It brings the knowing of the seasons. My grandmother, thank God we had the chance to, on my dad's side, to meet her, and there were different food on the plate, depending on the flowers we had, depending on the fruits, depending on what was on season. And this is very, very impregnate or alive in our culture. And that's something that biodynamics brings. It's more of an awareness of be open to that objectivity and that understanding of the forces of nature, and try to work in that cycle of living processes. So that's what I've seen. Also, rock dust is something very common around my town, especially that we live close to the rivers. I know it's not a biodynamic practice in itself, but it's kind of the beginnings of some of the preparations you're breaking and try to bring into a colloidal form the minerals and make them available for the plants. That's something that I've seen that's really good here in the
And
culture.
the old folks would do the rock dust as well.
Yes, and something really special about the Catholic um, inheritance, I would say, is the sense of festivity. And this is something that I've been able, grown Catholic, I've been able to find a space in which devotion and sacrifice meet with the festivals and the tradition, devotion and I can find some rhythms in nature where I've seen, for instance, um, the work with the preparations. Just to give you an idea, during Easter, around Easter, in that period of time, not on the Friday, not on Good Friday, is where we harvest most of the preps and out of the ground, right? And I've seen better results. For instance, during Candlemas, we make big festivals. So in the ocean, we acknowledge the La Reina del Mar, when in Brazil, Yemanjá. And that's kind of the beginning of the flowerings in our areas of the trees. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And
Queen of the
Christmas,
Sea.
the
Yeah.
Advent, yeah, that's very into the culture, and that observation and sitting with it and living with that tradition has guided me to an understanding of the rhythms of nature, even here in the tropics and the different seasons. See?
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. And it's, looking at the chart behind you there, Dad, it's like that there is a universal to it, even if it's subtle, like you were saying, Danilo, just that 10% change in light is significant and
Yes.
makes a
Especially in the
big,
forest. The
yeah.
sun flecks in the forest are crucial and determine if a tree will be able to grow and live more than 100 years in nature in this area. See, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I see a chart behind you, Dad. Is that
Yeah, this has been a great day. Uh, and uh, just to give a picture from what Matias said about that shaman in San Miguel, I brought a picture of the geology of that area and how the minerals in the soil had influenced the mesquite in such a way that the old people made from the mesquite and the minerals a remedy that help them with diabetes. And now down in that area, diabetes is rampant. And as I was speaking, I saw her in the back she came with a group of Huichol practitioners. And as I was speaking this kind of scientific thing, one of the guys reached over to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said something. And she shook her head and she pointed up at me and she said something and just went like this. And Matias told me later he wanted to go, and she said, "No, I'm learning something." And you know, for a woman, she's a national treasure down there. She's just not some lady off the street. She's the real deal, but she recognized in a scientific consciousness that there was something that was the basis of her practice. And to me, that is the link between the traditional practices and what we can provide out of a scientific consciousness. If we use the right kind of language, and that's what the chart is about. So up at the top, that's the 4 elements theory. Cold and hot are opposites. Wet and dry are opposites. And in today's science, we have cold, wet, hot, and dry as solid, liquid, gaseous, and heat. And thinking about nature in that way, it leads to deep abstraction. Things are always opposite something else. And after a while, that kind of thinking becomes binary consciousness. This is opposite that. How many ones are in the cold? Well, there's one more one in the cold than in the hot. So it must be cold. It's that type of polarized thinking that creates the difficulty, as Danilo was talking about, to have gratitude. That was the same thing Anthony was talking about. That was the same thing dear Eduardo was talking about. That this is about recognition of the invisible world behind the visible world that leads us to express gratitude through the festival life. So in traditional work, there is the 4 elements theory, or 5 if the Chinese or whatever. But within that is something called the temperament. And what I found in my work over the years, that temperament will take you much, much further than studying the 4 elements. Studying the 4 temperaments already is a kind of practice in recognition of the elemental beings and their dynamism. Rudolf Steiner didn't say bio-authoritarianism. You know, it was biodynamics. It's the dynamic of the polarities that is where a training can be developed to create a recognition of what is going on in my body, as Anthony was saying, is a nutrition that is a universal thing throughout the cosmos. And the subtleness of the temperaments is, instead of cold, I say cool. I study coolness rather than cold, because coolness is always relative to warmness. Cool and warm is always relative to coolness. And the shunting, or the slider between cool and warm, is something you can study whatever the phenomena is that you're looking at. Where is that slider and how does it move? When does it move? How does it move? What moves it? And I would say Danilo and Candlemas look at the solar length of day, no matter how long it is. If you keep records of the solar length of day and the initiation of flowering or leaf senescence or whatever, the solar length of day will allow you to see the sliding from warm to cool, from moist to dry, and back again from season to season. It's the sliding is the most important, and the solar length of day, even in the tropics, will give you a lot of insight into the flowering. You said the flowering happens all at the same time. If you've kept records for 10 years of the solar length of day, you would see a remarkable relationship to the solar length of day and the phenomenon that you're working with. This is the time to take the cow out to meet the bull. This is the time about the bees. This is the flowering. This is the dropping of the flowering. It's the setting of the fruit. So in studying temperaments, the slider between cool and warm has a great deal to do with the length of day, as the temperature and light have a kind of sliding relationship with each other. Moist is not wet. Wet is an absolute quality of moistness, but moistness is always in relationship to dryness. And I'm sure in the tropics you have moist and dry. I'm sure in the tropics you have cool and warm. You may not have cold, but you do have cool. So the temperaments, cool, moist, warm, and dry in my work are triggered by the solar length of day, which is the greatest cosmic rhythm we have. So if we want to get the cosmic nutrition going, I would say study temperaments rather than elements.
Right. And study the star that's closest to us and its rhythms first, perhaps.
Exactly. So you can find out what the festival is that you need to do. But in order to study it, we need to, what Eduardo was saying this morning about science, if you keep records, you can go back and you can make yourself objective, even with phenomena. You don't have to have statistics. You have to have a sequence of things in time that will allow you to give yourself a kind of feeling like the phenomenology that you're using is part of what is known as phenology in plants, which is the cycle of rhythms within the phenomena, the phenology of plants and animals. So that becomes then a scientific consciousness. And if you draw pictures of it during the year and make watercolors of it, then you're bringing an artistic consciousness to the documentation. That's like make a calendar. So it's been an amazing day. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And a theme that I was noticing in it is that a lot of folks were mentioning the inner mood or the intent of the practitioner in this. And to me, even though biodynamics is sort of explicitly about agriculture, it seems to me that there's even kind of a life philosophy in that. And maybe it's just because I've lived with a biodynamic gardener my whole life, but it seems to me that everyone today was talking about that. Maybe Matias, would you speak to how this has informs your sort of daily practices, the study of biodynamics?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was very inspiring when I began investigating biodynamics was just kind of looking at some of the stories that were around what is also known as this Kobowitz impulse, because this was also taking place in one of these very sacred solar nodes within the year, which we know as Whitsun or Pentecost. So there was a kind of a mood around already with the community that were receiving what Rudolf Steiner was saying. But the thing that really inspired me were a couple of things. One is that a lot of what Rudolf Steiner gave really came out of a love of agriculture. This wasn't something that he was just being asked to just give a download for farmers. He actually, in his youth, developed a deep love for agriculture, mostly through this type of relationships that he had with the peasant farmers who brought him in to teach him their old ways of breeding pigs or how to plant these potatoes. And these were part of his childhood that really set the basis for a lot of what began as this agriculture course. And there's many other little stories within that. But then as he was going through a period of his work, you're talking like post the burning down of the Goetheanum, and you have this difficulties of the post-war social conditions. There was just a lot of challenges, but there was a whole group of particularly young people who persevered over and over and over, asking Rudolf Steiner to please give us some of this addresses for a spiritual science or the spiritual foundations for agriculture. And there was also characters like Count Kaiserling, who also did great sacrifices to tell Steiner, I'm willing to stop my whole work with all these big estates, which Kobrowitz was a part of. And these big estates, I think it was like 20 some thousand acres, he was managing, mostly fodder beets for sugar production, that he said, in order for you to bring this, I'm willing to stop all of my work and just devote myself to helping this mission of within anthroposophy and agriculture. And Steiner, said, don't do that. But it was some of that devotional mood, the mood of perseverance and devotion from the young people, and his love for agriculture, all in this kind of mood of Whitsun, which is this basically, to just give a little snippet of what that is to me, is it's a festival for the future united soul community of individuals who are speaking the language of the heart. And so Steiner wove all that sort of through in kind of his rascal alchemy kind of way throughout the agriculture course. But having those pictures when you're working with the preparation or working in your garden of this great sequence of different spiritual deeds that were happening at that time, you can't help but to feel a little bit of gratitude and devotion towards the spiritual significance of what was taking place at that time and how that needs to be renewed.
Right.
And so just that for me has been a kind of something that always sort of carry, but when carrying that, there's very significant experiences that come through nature that really help not just how to work with your garden or farm, but also for your own inner landscapes, for your own soul healing, and working with your own biography and karma. And so that soul mood that you're asking the question about, of this kind of reverence and devotion, it really is part of the key to develop what Dennis was speaking about earlier, about this warmth of the heart, or the gemut. And I think that's what biodynamics really is a practice for developing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting to see, that it arose in some ways out of this recognition that those farmers had that their crops weren't doing as well. But as you say, Steiner in his rascal way saying, oh, this is about human evolution and, participation in spiritual development. So let's weave that all in. And so maybe that's the doorway, as Anthony said, that he started with biodynamics and then began to understand, oh, there's all these other aspects to it that really the intent is to provide spiritual resources for people to be able to take up their own spiritual development. I talk to parents about that with Waldorf education. It's not just to drain the mind, but the full human being. Yeah, Danilo, you had mentioned how wonderful you were feeling about bringing your children into it. And originally in your description, you talked a bit about the community aspect that having a biodynamic farm meant. Would you talk about how these principles have kind of informed your building of that community?
Thanks for the question, Ben. I think that's the mission that we have, to work on the social aspects, and that's where the healing and the massage that we as biodynamic shepherds and farmers can offer to the broader community or to a local community, especially in the community of San Cristobal where I lived. There has been kind of a breakdown or a disruption. We are a community that's deeply, deeply attached to our Arenal River, and most of my neighbors border the river. And on the other side of the river is where my mom lived, and she was born. It was an old hacienda, and there was a town there. And when I got here, I got here in 2014. It was more of a ghost town. Nobody lived there. It was an old hacienda that used to belong to a former president of Costa Rica, and then it was sold to a very wealthy person from the U.S., last name McCarthy, and he even owned, the hacienda has um, an airport for small planes. And long story short, the hacienda mm, was sold to a group from Colombia, and this group of Colombia had sugarcane, and then it was a monocrop, and then they brought in cows. And very recently, in 2017, at the other side of the river, when me and my family decided to make a living here, a huge, huge corporation, Pineapple Corporation, came. It's a 500 hectares of a green desert, and they work in a way in which is really impacting the river, to a point in which we are losing part of our farm because they have changed the river uphill, and also the mining of the rocks and sand has caused that. So uh, in the old hacienda town village, San Cristobal, nobody lives anymore. So it's difficult for my children because we do have neighbors. We organize, there are small children, and under privileged conditions, we organize small gatherings in the school. We give workshops, have open days in the farm. But it's very difficult because there is no community in our community anymore. We are kind of scattered,
Right.
and this corporation, they just have they see this land as a place when you punch in and punch out, and there's not that humanness anymore. But we are working in a way in which my daughters and our neighbors, and especially the young ones, develop that capacity that uh, make them want to hold space in their heart and in their souls, and their development, evolution as human beings, for this little place where they were born. And they will be the first to experience the geographical medicine that this land has for them. And this is our yearning, this is our duty, our mission. We want to really protect this river And hopefully, I feel that community nowadays, especially with communications and the elementals blessing us with this type of technologies, my community is ever expanding. And hopefully, we will be able to establish small sanctuaries or monasteries around the planet, the globe, and be able to exchange and try to be simpatico about each other. And maybe my struggles, Matias, I live in the same in Sacramento with the fires, or I don't know if that happened, or in Colombia when and that's what I feel about community now. This is kind of the labor we want to do. Um, I don't know if I expanded too much.
Yeah, no, I think I think Anthony mentioned the healing impulse that really lives behind biodynamics. That's the thread, and that speaks right to it. Yeah. Yeah, and ultimately that's a big part of the reason why we wanted to bring this symposium is to provide an opportunity for people to see that it's not just about like, okay, I could put the biodynamic label on my wine bottle and sell it for twice the price. It truly is about what we're doing on the land with the community around it. Yeah, the healing quality. That's funny. I was at one point spraying preps on the back of I had a little shared piece of property with someone, and I was spraying preps out there, and the woman came out freaking out, like, what are you spraying on the property? And I started to explain to her like what it was about, and her whole soul transformed in that moment when she recognized that I was bringing healing. It wasn't a pesticide, it was, a healing balm. And I think that there's opportunity for that when we can start to bridge these changes or bridge these avenues between, like Dennis said, using the appropriate language, whether it's the language with the traditional people to let them understand that science is not necessarily the problem. There can be an understanding and a bridging there, but also with the people who are doing the big ag and saying, there's other ways of doing this because they recognize I can only use this land for so long before it's a dust bowl. How do I maintain my business? Well, there are practices. You talk about the regenerative or the holistic, grazing. Amazing work in that. And I think it all feeds into the biodynamic impulse. So, are there practices and ways that you fellows have thought about that can bring rigor to the new research that maybe can restore the rivers? Because back in Steiner's time, there was nutritional kind of development, but we weren't dealing with the same sort of environmental challenges now that our plots often are dealing with, or the restoration, like you said, Dennis, the overburdening with the corn crop. What are ways that we can use these principles to restore and take it beyond so we're remediating?
Yeah, for me, what Anthony was talking about, um, cosmic nutrition builds an organ of perception of cosmic nutrition. It doesn't, it's not like, okay, now I get cosmic nutrition, and that's for me. No, the cosmic nutrition builds in my organs a sense of what is right for nutrition. And once I have in me a sense of what is right, that steers me towards other ways of looking at my food or at the river or at the weather or at my community. So Matias works a lot with developing the idea of what is a ritual. What do we mean by that? And some people are really put off by the idea of ritual. It's like, get out the holy water. And I say, yeah, get out the holy water. But why is the holy water holy? Well, it's from the river that we saved. So now it's holy again. There's something in the ritual nature of recognizing that there already is a script. And that's why I keep going back to the solar length of day, because in my old age, I've realized that's the script. If you record scientifically the phenomena through on something like Stella Natura, Alex will be here to talk about that. That's science, but it's a science of the rhythm of how the elements are tempered within the year. And that's what Candlemas and Michaelmas and Easter and Christmas, that's what those are about. They are about the transition. If you keep records of the acceleration and declination of the sun throughout the whole year, you will see that the major religious events happen when the sun is either accelerating or decelerating from its position. That's because the old people recognize something's changing. And you can watch, if you go out there every day and you watch, you'll see that the plants are part of that religion. They get it.
Yeah.
Let's understand the change from 9 hours and 40 minutes a day to 9 hours and 49 minutes a day. They will change. And not only the ones you're cultivating, this is everybody. Everybody. That's what my first doorway was. I went out one day and I looked and everything turned yellow. And I went, well, wait a minute, what just happened? Who flipped the switch? And then I said, okay, well, I have to go back and study this. The only thing I could find was that there was a change in declination on that day. So I wrote that down. And then I went back to my Stella Naturas for the past 10 years and I looked for indications. And sure enough, I had unwittingly recorded that just out of randomness. And suddenly I went, oh, I see. Everybody's tuned in to the same festival of light. And,
Yeah. Interesting.
and I think that that's what Candlemas is, isn't it? Then it's Candlemas, Michaelmas, and these things are keyed cosmically to the quality of nutrition that's coming in through the sun and the moon. And that's the basis of establishing festival of what? Light and darkness, right? And as they interact with each other, we have the color of the soul.
Yeah. So really working to develop those organs of perception. That's really the research trick.
It's recognition.
Yeah.
You're recognizing there's something, and that's the thing that will lead you to gratitude.
Yeah. Right, because it is so incredible.
It's so incredible. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
everybody else is on the page. You go to nature, they all get it, you know. Even the bugs, even the pests, even the damn peach leaf curl gets it.
Yeah.
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 I think that's the basis of understanding what the festival life is. It's not a random thing. It's
Right.
actually cosmic nutrition.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's interesting. Someone is asking, as a beginner, what's a good path in? And you might say, studying the festival life. And actually, Matias, you'll be talking a little bit about that tomorrow. And then Patricia Kaminsky will be talking about the archangels behind the seasons. I think that's a good place to start. But I'll also put a plug in for Dennis's book that we recently republished, the Biodynamic Book of Moons, and you can see that on soilsoulandspirit.com under publications. And of course, just the agricultural course, the Steiner book. It's the transcribed lectures. It's chewy, but I will know probably all three of you would say that multiple reads is well worth it. You get more each time you do it, and it's worth kind of grinding through it to kind of understand the core principles. But there is also, Matias, you had mentioned because it was the karma lectures were happening at that same time. And my understanding is there was also meetings with young people, with teenagers that he was doing all along the same time too, that
Yeah.
I think might feed into that. Was there work that came out of that work with the teenagers?
Um, so like I alluded to earlier, there was a whole group of youth there, and some were even, because of their capacities, even doing a lot of work, like Emmanuel Virgil and Ernst Barcht and a few others who were already doing applications on farms and managing things. They were really, yeah, sort of, on fire, you could say. And some of that fire for them, their experience was kept kind of being a little thwarted by you're not ready, or sort of a kind of a sort of the old guard sort of snuffer. And they really came to Rudolf Steiner to say, hey, can you really help us out with this sort of drama that we're experiencing? And somehow all that kind of culminated to the agriculture course lectures. And then immediately after that was done, they came to him and said, hey, can you spend some time? And you have to understand there was also this other sort of thing that was going on with Steiner's health at that time. He was sort of
Right.
kind of checking out physically. And but through this type of surrounding enthusiasm of the youth, he started to get some of his chipper back. And so that little series, I think it's called something like the Youth Search in Nature, there's some really interesting things that are in there. In fact, I'll probably bring something now that that's come up tomorrow that's out of them, that really sort of, he was like putting his finger on all the things we just been talking about, but had really yeah, expressed to them that the outcomes are not as important. It's just your perseverance, your striving, and devotion is. And that doing that from the hearts, eventually something will come in that you will feel like you're being led. And that, so it's not so much what needed to come from the society or come from all of the communities. He was trying to point to there is, this level of intuition where you feel you're being led by the spiritual world. So he really honored that. And then many wanted to keep going with conversations and conversations and conversations after the course, and on many high levels. Particularly what he brought was so significant that you would think there was going to be some ongoing meetings and discussions afterwards, but he cut it off immediately to go back to Stuttgart because a dear friend of his, who was a professor, I think, in one of the Waldorf schools, child had injured their eye in a pretty serious accident. And he says, I have to get back to help this child. Just to show you a little bit of the character of that individuality. And there was something in that healing gesture. Said, I can stay here and help prop up this big mission, but I need to go and do some healing work with this kid back at Stuttgart. So that we could say that healing work, yeah, was carried by the youth, and it turned into other different impulses and things over time. But I think there was something as a seed planted there for things to still, that I think is still relevant, for today and for the youth.
Yeah. Yeah, and I bring that up just because I feel like in my experience preparing for lectures, like you exist in this world as completely as possible to really bring it fully. And
Hmm.
the things that would have arisen also out of that same consciousness, I think probably are resonant and have different entry points for people.
Hmm.
I think it's interesting that the karma and the agricultural course came at the same time because there is a,
Yeah.
like Danilo, like what amazing karma that you ended up back on that property. Like, wow. And that you have this care for this river and you're bringing that extension and everyone downstream of that river, and your love and the care that you're bringing, like it's connected. No question. No question. Wonderful. Well, I think we have time for one more question in here. Um, there are some questions. Danilo, you're north of the equator, right?
Um, exactly around 10 degrees latitude.
Okay, so north.
Guanacaste, maybe 11. Yeah.
Okay. Because I know that there's always these questions about the northern and the southern hemispheres when it comes to things like the holy nights or the recognition of these times. I think it was Eduardo that touched on the idea that there's these cosmic events that are happening, and the position of the planet in there is going to be different, of course,
Mhm.
depending on your position on the planet. But then that cosmic event is still happening at that time. So, Christmas in New Zealand is shorts and hot dogs. How
Mhm.
does that change the way you think about these kind of ritual elements? Anyone really?
Beautiful question. I've been working during the holy nights for about, it's more of a labor of love. I don't see it as work for about 3 years now. I'm very new into it, honestly. And I can tell you that I'm still in the northern hemisphere, and it's such a blessing to go through each night and then experience epiphany. It's where the magi and the shepherds kind of meet, and that's in us as human beings, as souls. um, the shepherd is more of the way in which um, the heart goes to the head, and the magi is more of the head goes to the heart. That means that and it's what Dennis was bringing about the temperaments, right? And that's in us, and Christ is the bridge between, and the marriage between those two currents. And I would say that with the Magi, or you can see it as the Cain current, you develop understanding and objectivity, and then you work with what is the good in capital letters, the good of the world. And then the holy nights, depending on the rhythm, if you're in the south or in the north, you will be working in those two different polarities, in each, and you can divide it in 6 nights each, right? You divide it in a half. And then in the other polarity, you work with the warmth of the heart that the shepherd brings. And it's that process of moving what's in your heart to your mind. And it's beautiful because through enthusiasm expressed in the beauty with capital art, with capital letters, and you find joy in the art, in the processes of life, and in the processes of creating substance. And when they merge or marry, it's what we can experience as the inner transubstantiation, in words of Pfeiffer. And that's truth, or that's love, it's truth, and with capital letter. And it's what um, those nights resemble. It's when the truth, the highest truth came to the planet. And I think it's so big that it doesn't matter if you're in the north or in the south. It works in your soul if you sit with it and hold it in your heart, in your mind, and in your deeds, your action, your will.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it's the role that I have found as a shepherd and a agriculturalist. It's kind of that marriage between both. It's what Steiner could refer as um, the sacrament that we as farmers, as shepherds, can offer to the world. And there's when we can think of becoming the new priest of
Right.
this planet. And it's the new religion, the religion of the Father, right? And I think that's the process. That's the evolution. It's going forward. And we have two options. We are free. We have freedom. We get in tune with it, or we just stay stagnant. And since evolution is always going forward and we're stagnant, would that be evolution? You tell me. See?
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. Notice, Matias, anything to share there, to add there?
I think he said it quite beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what maybe is connected to another part of your question, that, all this time of working with different projects and helping to develop farm-based communities, it's really come to that people come to farms to work their karma out with others. And when that's understood, then nature becomes, a part of a school to help that karmic relationships and finding the healing kind of within it. And that, in the great chorus of the cycle of the year, like we've been speaking about, that becomes a great rhythm to help bring an understanding, sort of to stand under what is the meaning of my karma, and how am I sharing that with another, or how another can see that I'm going through that healing, and there's some kind of a recognition or awareness that, yeah, we had these things in common. And that has something to do with the healing and work in nature, or nature healing. And that's been yeah, a major reason why I've turned a lot of this preparation work into seeing it through the lens more of festivals. And that's been ultimately, I think, a work of helping to understand what these karmic relations are. Because it's funny, but thing to say, but the preparations teach you about karma. And that research within that is yeah, it's a healing path, or can be a healing path.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, fellows. This is such a rich day. I hope all our visitors out there, all our folks watching, have felt the same. So rest well, and blessings on everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Yeah, good night for those of you that are having a late night. Thank you to Joe, who's been in the background helping me get our speakers on stage and things. I think it's 2 a.m. for him, so sleep well, Joe. Sleep in tomorrow. We'll see you in the afternoon. And thank you all for joining.